Venice greatly fueled its own myth. The emblem of the city, well in sight on the summit of the Doge's palace, is justice. The Serenissima maintained a good reputation earned over the centuries for its fair administration, for the mercy of its laws, and the death penalty, given to hand, was an exceptionality compared to the average of the other states. Nobles and plebeians had the same treatment in court. Welcome to another episode of The Unwritten Venice. To the Venetians, the Republic gave the opportunity to secretly denounce the culprits through the so-called lion mouths, special boxes in which to insert the letters of complaint. They were so called because they were decorated externally with monstrous heads, sculpted with expressions that instilled fear and in whose mouth complaints were inserted. Every judiciary had its own lion's mouth. Initially, the letters of complaint were anonymous, but since many Venetians used this system for personal vengeance and too many had turned out the fake cases, the Serenissima decreed that, to open the investigation, they had to be signed by the accuser and contain the names of 3 witnesses. The administration of justice was run mainly by 3 bodies: the Council of 10, which was concerned with political crimes, the Quarantia Criminal for the criminal ones, the Quarantia Civil for the civil ones, and the Avogadoria de Comune, engaged in disputes between the state and the private individuals. The judges were members of the patrician class, and it was assumed that they exercised justice fairly and according to the supreme interest of the Serenissima. To understand the spirit with which justice was administered in Venice, it is enough to translate the Latin inscription that stands above the front door at the attorney's office of the Doge's palace. Before all things, always investigate scrupulously to establish the truth with justice and clarity. Do not condemn anyone except after a sincere and fair judgment. Do not judge anyone unsuspicious, but seek evidence and, in the end, make a pitiful sentence. Do not do others what you would not want to be done to you. The lawyers were native Venetian, by birth or acquisition after 10 years of residence in town or the state. It wasn't therefore a profession limited to the mere nobility. The only ones who could not undertake this profession were the forgers, the felons, the thieves, and the offenders of similar crimes or other infamy. Venice rejected the use of Latin in the management of justice from the very beginning of its history. Everyone had to understand what was said and judged, so it was used to speak in Venetian, while sometimes using Latin legal terms. The hearing could not last more than 1 hour and a half and was controlled by judges by an hourglass. The Major Council elected and paid 32 of the best lawyers to practice their profession on behalf of the poor. They were essentially a broader form of free patronage. There were also the noble prison lawyers who were obliged by extraction to defend those who were in prison. In the event of refusal, they were suspended for 5 years from the exercise of their profession. Torture, according to the custom of the time, was first psychological and then physical, and was applied to extort confessions, but also to prove a punishment. It was in fact practiced before the trial and to have ascertained guilt. The prisoners were locked in small cells made of wooden planks immediately above the torture room and connected to it with a wooden ladder. Here they were kept segregated alone and in the dark, with the aim of exerting a strong psychological pressure amplified by the threats of the guard. In the center of the chamber hangs the long rope with a sliding winch, hooked to the top of the beam of the abbey, to which the prisoner was tied and suspended, in order to dislocate the shoulders. Entreaties were the most common way of prisoners to communicate with magistrates and their demands, concerned the reduction of sentences, transfer to less harsh cells due to serious illness, protection from the demands of guards for the needs of their family who lived without more resources, or to help to pay for prison debts. The state provided only a small part of their needs, but the prisoners, once serving their sentences, could not get out of prison if they had not paid the debts of justice or the costs of prosecution, detention, compensation to third parties, etc. The many brotherhoods dealt with the prisoners, and their help proved extremely effective for their survival and in some cases also to ensure freedom. Their fundamental task was to collect alms, to pay the debts of the prisoners, and to assist those sentenced to the death penalty, giving them comfort and providing for their burial. In some cases, before the execution, the prisoner had the body part amputated, usually the right hand, tongue or ear, that was tied and hung around the condemned man's neck. The death sentences were carried out either secretly in the same cells, by strangulation, or public, through hanging or cutting the head between the two columns of Marco and Todaro in the Piazzetta. One can then quote an ancient threat, typically Venetian. You'll see what time it is, in reference to the fact that the last vision of the condemned to death was the clock of the square, just in line with the place of execution. Among the techniques of capital execution, there was the mazzolatura, that is, death by hammer blows to the back of the head, or beheading by sword. The criminals were then quartered. The pool remains exposed in direction of the four entrances to the city, and the head exposed on a picket near the stone of the Ben in St. Mark's Square, or was displayed among the red columns of the Doge's palace, from where the Doge also looked to attend the festivities in the square during Carnival. Water in Venice has always played a fundamental role, whether it was salty, therefore useful as a defense and a way of communication, or fresh and therefore very difficult to source. That is why those who were considered guilty of abuse or pollution of this resource had to pay with their lives. The same punishment was also reserved for those who violated public health. Around 1530, the entire Palazzo Ducale in Venice was completely refurbished. An entire wing was reserved for the administration of justice and gathered the courts, the offices of the judicial administration, and the two prisons, the so-called pozzi or wells, located on the ground floor, and the piombi, made from 3 large rooms located in the attic. Both were controlled by the Council of Ten, the supreme governing body, which had been operating in the city since the beginning of the 14th century. The wells and the piombi owe their names to the architecture of which they were made. The first were a set of very small cells, with only one bed axis and a shelf. The light was almost non-existent day and night. The ceilings of the cells were so low that they prevented the posture erected to the inmates, and the isolation was total. These burials, as the Venetian authorities themselves called them, were together with torture, causing madness and death for the wretched who were locked up there. The only comfort for inmates and guards was the temperature that remained constant as a result of the thermal insulation of the premises, lined with wood and almost devoid of air. The piombi, whose name comes from the lead metal used for roofing, appear as places of almost human captivity. They were intended for prisoners awaiting trial or belonging to high social groups, who were granted a certain benevolence. Unlike the wells, it seems here that living conditions were acceptable and that a certain freedom of contact with the outside world was allowed. Prisoners could even be handed over personal goods. In 1563 were joined the so-called new prisons, the first building in the world built to be specifically a prison, that inmates reached through the Bridge of Sighs, so called because they were sighing, thinking of lost freedom. Under the porch, in the center, the entrance portal, and on the sides windows, the prisoners, through the bars, could get in direct contact with the outside world. Most of the cells had direct light, and those on the ground floor opened directly outside, on the canal, on the alley, or on the courtyard, intended for those convicted for minor crimes. The others were completely blind. They were coated with large boards on the floor and walls, but over time they left with their natural coating in healthier and less expensive Istrian stone blocks. The living conditions of the inmates in the palace prisons were particularly harsh, difficult, and sometimes inhuman, especially in the wells. The often poor quality food, the dirt and stench, the unbearable heat in summer and the cold in winter, the rats and the parasites hidden under the floorboards and walls. Lastly, the number of the prisoners crammed into very cramped rooms were the main reasons for the very serious hardships in prisons. Those who showed up their own accord if suit, in addition to a decrease in the sentence, could also circulate in the palace courtyard and meet anyone. Others were granted probation by day to deal with their affairs, and they had to return to their prison in the evening. The prisons of Venice were famous for being the safest. Only one man managed to escape, and his name is known all over the world, not for this feat, but for anything else. His name was Giacomo Casanova, the famous womanizer. Curiosity. If you come to Venice, pay attention to the fourth column of the porch of the Doge's palace, overlooking St. Mark's Basin, and you will notice that it's farther out than the others, and that the step of the external base is constant. In the past centuries, this side overlooked directly in the water. To the man sentenced to death was given the opportunity to do the last lap, which consisted of resting his back to the column, hugging it from behind, and trying to turn it around while keeping his feet on the step. Those who failed fell into the water, and, if they did not drown, were finished and executed. Whoever succeeded was pardoned instantly. From what has come to us, no one has ever made it. So thank you for watching. If you love this video, please subscribe and share.